It was nice. I
Past there's usually something about it, yeah. Don't give up yet.
So, is there any? Get started.
Yes.
Good. Hello, welcome, Happy New Year, and of course to all of you online as well. It just so happens, not by design, but perhaps the power of what's happening in the world at the moment, that the 4 talks this semester, of the 4 talks this semester, 3 of them are on the United States, on some aspect of its nationhood, democracy, and, if you like, the crisis of nationhood and democracy in the US at the moment. And the first of these talks is right now. Very pleased to have Eric Woods from the University of Plymouth for that talk. Eric has a PhD from the LSE and is an associate professor in sociology and the deputy head of the School of Society and Culture at the University of Plymouth. His research examines the intersections of politics, culture, and communication, with a particular focus on how these phenomena relate to nationalism. His most recent book, co-authored with Dr. Robert Schweitzer of the University of Toronto, is entitled "The New Nationalism in America and Beyond: Deep Roots of Ethnic Nationalism in the Digital Age." Eric has also researched the cultural politics of Britain's imperial past, and he has published extensively on Christian Indigenous relations in Canada, including the 2016 book, "The Long Road to Apology: A Cultural Sociology of Anglican Mission and the Indian Residential Schools in Canada." In addition to his role at Plymouth University, Eric is a faculty fellow in the Center for Cultural Sociology at Yale University, and he's a board member of several leading journals and research associations in his fields of study. So, welcome, Eric. And following our usual format, Eric will talk to us for about 45 to 50 minutes, then we'll have about something like the same amount of time for discussion, unless questions run out earlier than that. And we will then have our usual drink session, and in fact, we'll have it in our usual space, that's to say downstairs by the cafe space in this complex. So don't disappear. Join us. We can all troop down there. Follow Lauren. She'll show us the way there, because probably, unless you know these corridors very well, which I don't, we're likely to get lost. So I hope you'll stay for drinks. And meanwhile, over to you, Eric.
Thank you very much, Tarek. Great introduction, and thanks to all of you for attending the talk, and thank you for inviting me. It's I've been aware of the Center for Ethnicity and Citizenship here for quite some time, and it's just an absolute pleasure to get the chance to be here. So thank you very much. And Lauren, if you can warn me when I'm getting close. I don't know why, I didn't know how long I had to talk, and I just designed this PowerPoint slide, so you'll have to.
5 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. So I guess without further ado, we'll get into the talk, and I look forward to your questions afterwards. Now, can I just start switching?
Yeah,
okay with. Okay, so before I begin, I just thought I should begin with a little bit of a preamble to some kind of full disclosure about the paper. The paper that I'm going to be presenting today is just kind of hot off the press, just been published in the journal Political Communication. And I'm not the sole author. This was published with a variety of academics, all of whom are based at University of Montreal or University of Toronto. All these names in the middle were our research assistants, and then kind of another lead author was Rob Scherzer, my frequent collaborator who Tarek mentioned. Research for this paper was also funded by the British Academy as well as the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And I should also say, if after the paper you have some questions about methods, data, the coding process, we put all of the materials on the Harvard Dataverse. And so by all means, feel free to consult that if you're thinking, I don't agree with the way he's coded or whatever it might be. Okay, so let's begin. So really the kind of thing into this paper, after quite a long time of, as Tarek mentioned, of thinking about the resurgence of ethno-nationalism in the liberal democracies of the West, it started to occur to me that we needed to broaden our scope and think more comparatively, and rather than just look at people on the right who were using nationalist discourse, but look at how it's used on both the left and the right. And that coincided around the time of the 2020 presidential election in the US. It was upon watching some of the speeches that I thought, okay, there's something here and we've got to do this paper right away, Rob. And just to give you a kind of example, we've got this very typical speech that Donald Trump delivered at the National Archives saying, "Our mission is to defend America's founding, the virtue of America's heroes, and the nobility of the American character. The only path to national unity is through our shared identity as Americans." And countering that, also in 2020, Biden argued that this is a battle for the soul of America. It is about who we are as a nation, what we believe, and maybe most importantly, who we want to be. It's about our essence. It's about what makes us Americans. And so I kind of saw these quotes of these speeches and I thought, geez, national identity seems to be kind of core to the election and campaign communication. And I thought this begs a further investigation over what role national identity does occur in campaign communication in the US. So from that, I asked myself, Rob and I asked ourselves 3 linked questions. First, we wanted to establish, how did Trump and Biden represent national identity? And that linked to our second question, to what extent was this depiction of national identity a source of contestation? So in what ways they were contesting it? And then we wanted to kind of dig a little bit further and say, what does this contestation tell us about America's polarized political landscape? Because there's a lot of literature, as you might be aware of, on political and effective polarization in American politics. Much of it doesn't discuss polarization over the meaning of national identities. So we thought that there was a way to address that shortcoming. So how do we do this? I'll discuss this in the paper, but just to summarize, we thought, well, we need to design a new analytical framework to analyze Trump and Biden's presidential campaign. And we do that by focusing on their Twitter communication, or now X. So what are the aims of this paper? Kind of break it down into 3 aims: empirical, methodological, and normative. So as I just mentioned, empirically, we want to find out, how did Trump and Biden use nationalist rhetoric in their campaign communication? This links to our methods. We want to create a new model for a comparative contextual analysis of nationalist rhetoric in American political communication. And as I'll talk very briefly, we do this by drawing on insights from research on political culture and the comparative study of nationalism. And we also have within this paper a kind of normative aim. And that's that we want to shed light on how this competition over America's national identity is exacerbating political polarization. And we think that in some small way, at least, it's also leading to democratic backsliding, or the potential for democratic backsliding. So in response to these questions, what does the literature say? So if you were to Google Scholar anything on nationalist rhetoric, nationalism, national identity in American political communication, you'll have actually, there's an emergent literature which is growing by the hour, it seems like. Lots of it is focusing on Trump and then kind of Trump acolytes. And that's interesting because it kind of links to a little bit of a longer literature that focuses, when people focus on nationalism, they focus on right-wing candidates, almost exclusively in the literature on political communication, with the exception of maybe 2 or 3 pieces. And this tendency, I thought, since I wanted to do something comparative, this tendency to focus on the rhetoric, and it tends to be one right-wing political candidate, so it doesn't tend to be comparative. It gives the impression that the meaning of American national identity is relatively uncontested, and that it's mostly the concern of people on the political right. And I thought, well, this ignores the possibility that national identity is contested, much in the way that we saw that both at the opening of this talk, Biden and Trump were contesting national identity. And that's contested by both the left and right of the political spectrum. Now, I should also say, if you're interested in the literature here, by all means, I'm happy to share that with you. I just didn't want to get bogged down. I already make my PowerPoint slides way too text heavy, and I thought it's just a wall of surnames. So definitely get in touch with me if you want the literature in this area. So interestingly, our kind of hypothesis that it's not just a concern of the right, but it's contested on both the left and the right, really aligns with insights from American political culture, whose findings are quite in stark contrast with the work on political communication. And that's because research on American political culture suggests that there has long been a struggle over the meaning of American national identity. And it tends to focus on a struggle between an exclusionary tradition, which privileges white American identity, and a more inclusive tradition that's grounded in the classical liberal ideas of the founding documents. And there's quite a few people, probably the most well-known work in this area is by historical institutionalist named Roger Smith, who's done quite a bit of work in this area of American political culture. Now, some recent work, particularly by a scholar named Bart Bonikowski, has shown that this conflict in the development of American political culture is becoming more entrenched, such that the main political parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, are increasingly opposed on these two traditions, and indeed their followers are as well. Now, interestingly, this work on American political culture aligns quite well with work in the comparative study of nationalism, where there has long been debate over whether there is a kind of so-called ethnic and civic nationalism. It was highly criticized at the opening of the 2000s, but some people, including myself, have been starting to repurpose the concepts, not to kind of suggest that they're so-called civic nations or kind of essentialized notions of ethnic nations, but rather there's often cleavages within national states between a kind of civic nationalism rather than civic nation and civic nationalism. And we kind of use these as ideal types rather than descriptors of reality. So we've got something interesting here where these historians of political culture are finding this kind of cleavage in American culture. And interestingly, people in nationalism studies find that as well. Interestingly, those don't always align. For whatever reason, people who study nationalism don't often study the American case, vice versa. So we've got to build an analytical framework if we're going to address these questions. And to do this, we pulled on insights that I just described on American political culture and nationalism to develop a framework for examining how political actors use and contest nationalist myths and symbols in their rhetoric. Now, I should say at the outset, how do I understand nationalism and national identity? In this paper, I approach nationalism primarily as a meaning-making ideology, and its main concern is cultivating and defending a distinct conception of national identity. And this meaning-making occurs through culture, and that is to say through myths, symbols, rites, practices, etc. So nationalism is the ideology that infuses national identity with meaning, the way that it's understood in this paper. And because of this, This means that national identity is often a vector for cultural conflict between competing conceptions of national identity. So you have different actors trying to attach potentially differing or opposed conceptions of national identity or meanings to national identity. And often we can characterize this as a struggle between civic and ethnic nationalism. Now, alongside these insights and concepts, we also wanted to enable a kind of fine-grained analysis. I should move this up. So that we could really pinpoint the way in which different actors ascribe meanings to national identity. And so what we did is we created a schema based on kind of 5 key or foundational reference of national identity. And this was based on a kind of wide reading of secondary literature on ethnicity and nationalism. And of course, it could be hotly debated by you, and we'll see later. These are kind of 5 reference of national identity. People, so how is the nation's membership and its boundaries perceived? Territory, how is the nation's territory perceived? Religion, history, and place in the world. Now, we should say that often these will overlap in a given nationalist discourse or in nationalist rhetoric. And oftentimes they're so intertwined, they're hard to disaggregate. So in the American case, we have a lot of literature recently on Christian nationalism, or what's called white Christian nationalism. And we've got a history there where whiteness is attached very strongly to certain forms of Christianity in America. But I think that it's important to at least conceptually disaggregate that, because then it enables you to kind of compare over time if you're interested in processes of, let's say, when there was actually boundary making process that occurred within Christianity. Whiteness has tended to change over time in the United States, particularly with Irish Catholics, Eastern and Southern Europeans. So I think conceptually it's important to separate, even if they become intertwined in practice. Okay. Sorry, wherever I move
You
this.
put like the minimizer, so you see like the little.
Yeah.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay. Just keep moving it around like, I can't remember, Tetris. Yeah, Tetris. Okay, so that's our framework. Now, how do we actually go out and analyze these tweets? How do we use this framework? So here's our methodology. So to understand how conflicting traditions of national identity manifested in the 2020 campaign, what we first did is map the constituent myths and symbols using our 5 reference. And so here we went to the historical literature on American political culture and started to map key myths and symbols of American identity according to the inclusive and exclusive traditions. We then used that as a coding framework for analyzing Trump and Biden's Twitter communication. And we basically started at a 6-month period prior to November 23rd, 2020 presidential election, and looked at every tweet by Joe Biden and Donald Trump, and that equaled just over 4,300 tweets. And we collected those tweets using R tool, which is an R package. And we notably coded all of these by hand, the 5 of us authors. And we didn't use an interreliability score because it's such a contextual analysis, but rather we use a kind of consensus approach where 2 people will code, 2 others will code, and then you come in a conversation and discuss why you came up with a certain code. So it's quite a long process. And of course, we uploaded all of that onto NVivo. And you can, I'll put the link to Dataverse afterwards if you want to see how we did that. Okay, alongside that, as I mentioned, we also did a very kind of light sentiment analysis to look at whether it's conveying positive, negative, or neither. And that probably going to a future paper. Oh, what's happening here? Okay, so this does not include the whole coding framework, but I thought just to give you a kind of like taste of what we were doing here, I included some of the codes for people. So remember, that was one of the reference. That's how is the nation's membership perceived. And we coded civic and ethnic tradition. And all of the symbols, because symbols can be hotly contested, we kind of listed as indicative symbols. And then we would have to go and look at the context of the tweets to decide what side of the cleavage that it would lie upon. So you can see here, it's as you would probably imagine, kind of central myth of the American people and the civic tradition is that the basis of American unity is classical liberal ideals such as natural rights, liberty, equality, rule of law, representative government, etc. Of course, this that you hear kind of Biden speak about quite often, that anyone can be American regardless of their backgrounds. There's also this view that America is a uniquely diverse nation, which does not prioritize any one ethnic, racial, religious, or socioeconomic group. And in fact, that's often linked to a myth that that's the source of American strength. On the other side, on the ethnic tradition, which remember privileges white American identity or the markers of white American identity, a key myth is that America is a white, and this was formerly Anglo-Saxon nation, whose people are innately superior to all other races. Another myth is that white Americans have a uniquely innate love of classical liberal ideals and natural rights, liberty, equality, and representative government. And now this is very interesting. And for those of you who've done comparative work, let's say on France, it's very similar, where in fact, in a recent book, we found that kind of ethno-nationalism in nation states that see themselves as the kind of inheritors of the liberal tradition, they kind of ethnicize civic ideals. And it gets kind of coded as something that's innate. And that can become a boundary symbol, so it's still exclusionary in the sense that you might exclude Muslims from your definition of the French nation, because you might say, well, they don't have a capacity to love liberty in the way that we do because they're Muslim. And in fact, that's the way that Trump coded Islam constantly in his tweets. And so this is here because of its kind of ethnic codes. It's something innate. Okay. And as I said, we did that with how's territory represented, religion, so on and so forth. Okay, so let's get to the findings. What did we find after we did our coding? Well, the first thing that came out to us is that nationalist myths and symbols were absolutely central to Trump and Biden's campaigns. In fact, it was a plurality of both of their tweets. We're just simply referring to these myths. And interestingly, they were more important to Biden. In fact, Biden's Twitter communication was, to us, as Robert Schertzer, my co-author, said, he's a myth-making machine. It's just almost like he read our coding framework and said, this is what America represents, where our strength is our diversity, blah, 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 like on and on, where we're working towards a kind of promised land, where whatever it might be, it just kind of went on and on. And as I'll discuss further, Trump's was much more implicit and a bit harder to read. But both of them were involved in this kind of battle over myths, over what is the meaning of America. And as we expected, the candidates further structured their nationalist rhetoric around competing visions of national identity, which aligned very well with the cleavage that's described in the literature of American political culture. And that means that Biden more commonly referred to the civic tradition and Trump more commonly referred to the ethnic tradition. And interestingly, as I'll discuss briefly, they did not, even though this is the vast majority of their tweets, they did not exclusively refer to one tradition or the other. So sometimes Biden would refer to myths that align with the ethnic tradition, and sometimes Trump referred to myths that align with the civic tradition. More in the latter case. With respect to Trump, there was this crossover. And as we found too, it's not just that, so we were looking for instances, just the frequency of using these myths and symbols, but we were also interested in context in order to look at the way in which these myths and symbols were used in relation to other key themes, whether they were talking about policing, as you'll see, a major topic in the campaign, immigration, what have you. And what we found, they're often paired together. And in that way, the nationalist rhetoric provided a framing device for all the other topics in the campaign. So what we have here is that they're just simply myth-making machines, but they're also using these myths as framing devices for understanding the meaning of other topics. And because that occurred, we weren't just looking at kind of the descriptive statistics, but we wanted to also look qualitatively at how this framing occurred. And that's what I'll kind of discuss with you now. And sorry for this rather big wall of text here. So the way I'm going to divide this discussion is I'm going to start with Biden, and I'm going to talk to you, kind of summarize how he referred to us, and then, or the so-called in-group, and I'll also discuss how we referred to them, the out-group. And I'll do the same with Donald Trump as well. So let's say, who are the American people and who are they not? What is the American territory and what is it not? What is American history and what is it not? So we start with the we side. So he campaigned in kind of summary on the idea that he was best placed to reunite America after a period of division wrought by the illiberalism of Trump. And to do so, Biden argued that Americans needed to restore their civic identity. And as we saw, he depicted the American nation as fundamentally an inclusive community grounded in liberty and equality, which does not prioritize anyone based on their background. And we found that this kind of definition of American identity was in particular used in combination with Biden's tweets about racial justice and with policing. And he described racial justice as a core value of civic American peoplehood. He also frequently put American history into a civic narrative of American progress. And he argued that America's destiny was to overcome the illiberalism of the past and progress to a unified future when all Americans are treated equally. And you probably often, if you watch the election at all, you talked about as being at an inflection point. That is to say that the election was a critical moment in the nation's history. It was about who we are as a nation and what we believe, and maybe most importantly, who we want to be. And those tweets about protests around racial justice, around policing, were often framed in that historical narrative in order to kind of infuse meaning about what does this mean, these protests? Well, it means that we're on the path towards this civic destiny. He also referred to civic myths about America's place in the world, and I think that was less so than people in history. And that is to say that America is the world's protector of democracy and a beacon for hope for all. Now, who are we not in Biden's tweets? So according to Biden, the kind of main threats or outgroups to American civic identity are the forces of racism and ethno-nationalism. And within that, he would describe Trump as the central exponent of these ideologies. So Trump is the main threat to America's civic identity. He also regularly, interestingly, criticized law enforcement and its treatment of Black people. And he tweeted regularly that this treatment was not aligned with the true values of America. It was pretty unambiguous. Almost all of his tweets were a negative characterization of American law enforcement. Now, because of the way in which he framed Trump, we argue that Biden's criticism of Trump was deeper than just citing his support for white nationalist and racist ideas. He presented Trump as antithetical to America's identity, which made him, as he says in one of his tweets, unable and unfit to bring the country together to overcome its threats and challenges. Now, before I turn to Trump, just what's happened here. just as I mentioned, they sometimes crossed over. So just to mention Biden's use of the ethnic tradition as well, we found a minority of his tweets were also kind of leaning into not the civic tradition, but the ethnic tradition. And in particular, a common theme was an idea of American exceptionalism. And these tweets included statements that very subtly, it's true, very subtly. And in fact, when we were going through the rounds of revisions on this paper, there was quite a debate with one of the reviewers who felt like it's too subtle. There's no there, but I feel that there is. He's implying that Americans have a kind of innate greatness, that their prosperity is because of the inherent superiority of his people. Some of his tweets would suggest that America's greatness is not because of what they've constructed and what they've done, but there's something innately great about them that, in my view, is implying a kind of ethnicization of the American people there. He would also more frequently evoke this ethnic myth that the true American homeland is found in its small towns rather than its large cities. And here he would tweet in coded language about his own values, which would imply true American values were shaped by his upbringing in Scranton. And interestingly, he would juxtapose that with the kind of big city values of Trump. So try to position Trump as the city. Now, this is interesting. You might say, well, what does this have to do with meaning of national identity? There's a long history in American political culture where the cities are seen as the place where the outsiders arrive, and the cities is not the place of real America. Real America, that is to say, white America, is in the small towns, on Main Street, the small towns, where the hard working people of America exist. And so there was a kind of implication there that was a kind of ethnic myth that he was leaning into. He also strongly identified as a Christian in lots of his tweets. And he even tweeted that Christian values made him ready to lead America. So let's move on to Trump. Now, Trump centered his messaging on a narrative that America was losing its greatness because of the growing power of a series of both internal and external threats vetted by Biden. And accordingly, this election, as one tweet said, was a battle to save the heritage, history, and greatness of our country. Now, interestingly, contrary, as I mentioned, to Biden's, he was very explicit with his use of civic nationalist myths and symbols to refer to the in-group. Trump's use of ethnic nationalist myths and symbols was often implicit, almost always implicit. And I think here, as lots of people have remarked, we use coded language or dog whistles. And that has to do with the kind of continued somewhat dominance of liberal ideas in the American public sphere. So we can't exactly say America is for white American people. We would do so in a kind of coded way. So we would often talk about the true American people. And in doing so, his tweets kind of conjured up an image of this kind of embattled hidden majority within America that was at risk of losing its power. And almost all of his tweets about us was directed to this embattled group. We actually referred to true America, real Americans, the vast silent majority, which he tweeted would reign again. Now, what is this silent majority or real America? And here you kind of have to read into the kind of language that he's using. And here he would often use first-person pronouns, which he would commonly juxtapose with plural third-person pronouns. So he would talk about ours and they and we and them. There's a kind of unspoken group in this time. So if you remember from 2020, he was very concerned about the tearing down of statues to American history. And this would be a typical tweet. They are determined to tear down every statue, symbol, and memory of our national heritage. Well, what is he talking about here? He's talking about statues and symbols and memories related to, in fact, that tweet was related to, it was, I'm trying to remember what it was. Too many tweets, but it's often in terms of a battle over statues and the former Confederacy. So these are statues that anyone who knows the context is referring to white Americans and a particular white American history. So the our is implied there, and the they are not real Americans. So who are we not? So that's his in-group, this embattled majority. So his most prominent threat was actually the radical left, which was an interesting departure from 2016, which we did, we quoted all of his tweets in 2016, and it was almost exclusively immigrants and Islam. But here he started to talk about radical left, and that was his main outgroup. Interestingly, radical left also had these allusions to ethnicness and symbols, particularly in relation to BLM and racial justice protests that were occurring throughout the campaign. And here again, it was in relation to third person pronouns that you would start to make sense of this. So he would talk often about how the radical left and critical race theory is threatening our history, destroying our cities. He would talk about how criminals, thugs, and looters were coming for suburban housewives, often in relation to the possibility that Biden was going to allow public housing to be built into the suburbs. And if you know some American history, this discussion of the inner city being plagued by criminals, thugs, looters, and anarchists tends to refer to Black Americans, and critical race theory is, of course, a key dog whistle as well. In terms of external threats, he would often talk about China tapping into COVID-19. COVID-19 was described as a foreign, specifically Chinese virus. It was the Wuhan virus, the China virus, and the China plague. Suggesting that real Americans don't get this virus. They're often somewhere else. Another frequent threat were the globalists, and this kind of taps into his populism and their elite allies, which according to Trump was Biden. Biden's the kind of key ally of the globalists, these kind of shadowy global elites. And according to some tweets, Biden was therefore working to take away the American dream from real Americans. So these are his outgroups. Now, how did Trump at times borrow from the civic tradition? Well, he did quite a few times, much more again than he did in 2016. You could tell he was trying to expand his constituency in 2020. And he has nearly 50 tweets where there some variation of, I am fighting for every citizen of every race, color, and creed. And we repeat this often again. He also had tweets in Spanish quite a few times, 20 or 30 times. But these were often, countered in context with the vast bulk of his other tweets, where he would double down on the associating immigrants from the southern border with criminality, with gangs, the drug trade, illegal drug trade. And he would often have positive tweets similarly about Black Americans, but he would counter this incredibly vast number of negative tweets about racial justice and about BLM, and also about inner cities, which he referred to these kind of like rat-infested holes. So there's this occasional Black Americans should support me. I support all Black Americans, blah, 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 whatever it might be. But then he's got these wall of negative tweets about the protest for racial justice at the time. Okay, so how am I doing for time?
7 minutes.
Oh, perfect. Okay, so let's bring it back. What does this all mean? So our kind of concept coming out of this paper, nationalist polarization, we feel is the primary takeaway from this paper. Primary takeaway is that nationalist polarization between civic and ethnic traditions of American national identity was absolutely central to the 2020 presidential campaign. And as we discussed, these traditions weren't just kind of tweeted out as myths and symbols. They were used as framing devices. And we found particularly in relation to BLM and policing. So for Trump, the protests demonstrated America's decline from greatness through their attacks on the heroic defenders of law and order. In contrast, for Biden, the protests were part of the struggle for America to achieve its liberal destiny through their confrontation with the malign forces of racism. So the centrality of national identity to Biden's campaign, we found runs against the tendency in the literature, which I mentioned, which tends to just focus on right-wing political actors as nationalists. And I think the blind spot here is that we tend to recognize, at least in the US, only one conception of national identity as nationalist. The other conception might be defined as patriotic or whatever it might be. It's coded as non-nationalist, where we found it kind of provided indeed the language or the grammar for the campaign. And also, because we took this historical perspective by drawing on the research on American political culture, we found that the traditions that they drew upon had deep historical roots. And interestingly, when you take a step back, then it starts to look like the 2020 election was not a struggle over contemporary issues of the day. It looked like a kind of ongoing or an iteration of a long-standing struggle over national identity. So if you have like a kind of long-running drama over what is the meaning of American national identity, like Biden and Trump were just the most recent combatants in the struggle. Now, what does this mean for polarization and democracy? And here is, I'm kind of moving a little bit away from the findings and doing a little bit of more blue sky thinking. So I think that the centrality of these competing visions of national identity is potentially a worrying development in the context of increasing political polarization. And there's a few reasons for why I think this. So one is that in the kind of like Habermasian mode, a democratic public sphere should be guided by rational debate so that somehow you could convince the other side of the kind of rationality of taking one position on an issue or another, that we could change our ideas. Now, nationalist rhetoric appeals to emotions rather than reason, as does any kind of meaning-centered ideology. And you can't really be convinced why we should see American history as one way or another, or how to define American people, because that's something felt rather than reasoned. And that means that it'd be very difficult to convince your opponents otherwise. So this, in my view, is kind of further entrenching polarization. Now, what we also found is that when national identity is contested, this, well, not just raised the possibility, what we found is that the opponents were represented as an external other, which means that they were represented as someone outside of the national identity. In fact, they were represented as a threat. And so what does that mean? That means that Biden represented Trump as kind of inimical to American national identity, and implicitly also his supporters, the so-called MAGA people. And on the other side, Trump did that about Biden. And interestingly, they represented each other as kind of existential threats to one another. So what we've got here is that we don't have a kind of both agreeing about the boundaries of the democratic community, but in fact, there's a cleavage in the boundaries, and the other side is represented as a kind of other that is threatening us. And you may disagree here, but I tend to agree with Mill that you need some sense, some minimal sense of what he referred to as common sympathies for a successful liberal democracy. You need to kind of agree some minimally about the parameters of your political community. But if we're cleaving over the very definition of who we are, then I would suggest that there's a risk that the losing side will not recognize the winning candidate's legitimacy. And of course, you know, you're probably thinking, 3 minutes, okay. That I've come to that conclusion, you know, writing this paper in the wake of what occurred in January 6th, 2021, where of course what we have is a lot of people on the losing side, on the Trump side, just simply does not recognize the legitimacy of Biden winning the election. And we think what we find here goes some distance to explaining why that is the case. Okay, so I guess I will leave it there. For some reason it worked out. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. That was very interesting.
Keep going.
Yeah, thank you. That was very interesting, and I think can provide a basis for a very interesting and a very contemporaneous discussion about what's happening in the US, but also I think wider themes about nationalism and civic ideals and so on. So does anyone want to kick off? Yes, Andrew, please do.
Really interesting, thank you. I just wondered why you opted to focus on Twitter and not on there's a kind of related methodological question, which is, I think we have pretty good grounds for thinking these are Trump's tweets, but I kind of wonder whether these are Biden's tweets, or whether they. So there's a slight kind of imbalance there between the two sets of data.
Yeah, that's a good question, which we debated often, because in fact, you can see right away that the way in which tweets are written are different. You can imagine that Biden's tweets are written by a team of people, whereas Trump's probably a team, but he's obviously tweeting a lot himself. So the first part of the question, why Twitter? Well, because this might start to change now that we've kind of moved over to X, there's new ownership, but up until 2020, Twitter had become kind of, in our view, the kind of central clearinghouse of the communication for the campaigns. So it's not just that Twitter was occurring in isolation, but what was going out in the TV adverts and so on and so forth was also linked to what's happening in Twitter. And Twitter is also important because even though majority of Americans are not reading Twitter, a majority of Americans report on being aware of Twitter, particularly like Trump's Twitter. And that's because their tweets are reported in the media. There's something circular going there. So we found that Twitter, up until that point, had become just kind of critical to campaigns. So that's why we chose Twitter. But now we're kind of beginning a project on looking at TV campaign ads, because Twitter is very difficult to interpret if you're kind of trying to do a contextual study, because of course you have a limited number of characters in a tweet. Whereas if you look at a long speech, or you go in person to a rally, or you look at a campaign ad, there's a lot there that you can unpick. And so it was made more difficult in that sense for us, I guess. People tweet long stories, and so you can't look at tweets in isolation. It's not given to, you need a qualitative study. I would suggest to all of those who are doing just like pure quantitative, because they're not disaggregated from each other. Now, the second part of the question, well, what about the possibility that they use Twitter differently, or that they're not the sole authors of Twitter? And I guess for the purposes of this study, I think that's an important question, but we didn't find it important for this study because in a sense, we weren't worried about who the author was. It was more about how they were framing the issues of the day and what kinds of words they were using. And in our view, as you can probably see why we took this kind of historical view, political actors in the communication are as much shaped by historical institutions as they constitute them. And so that's to say, it's not just that the teams are in charge of Biden's communication and the teams in charge of Trump's communication are necessarily saying, okay, let's use this myth in relation to this and this. They might be thinking this works here, but they might not know why. They just feel that, oh, you got to represent America like this, or talk about the statues here, that would make sense. And they're unconsciously drawing upon a kind of like interrelated, kind of like huge historically constitute bulk of myths and symbols that they just innately know that this makes sense at that point. And so we don't see them just as instrumental actors shaped by these historical institutions. And so for us, long story short, the actual person who's doing the tweeting is not so important. Which of course you could debate, yeah.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Thanks very much. Really interesting. I have two questions. I mean, the first one is really interesting how you try to how you position nationalism not only in relation to right-wing politics, but at the same time, I was wondering when you were talking, you actually position Biden on the left. And that is quite a claim that one would make if one would do that. So I was just wondering what actually your analysis does to a framing really of kind of like nationalism that is not just on in the center or conservative or on the right, but actually we can think more on the left as well. And my second question is, I was just a little bit surprised actually with the last slide when you imposed almost a Habermasian lens on the material. And I was just wondering if we could talk a little bit more about why do you actually think that a Habermasian lens is useful to work through that material or with and maybe against some of that material, and why you not, for example, take a framework like a radical democratic lens, for example, or something like that, that kind of like would not think about democracy as this kind of like rational debate and that kind of like vehicle to reach consensus based on the rational debate.
Also great questions. The first question, you know, remind me, really got into it.
On the left.
Yeah, okay, so yeah, that's a really good question. Probably the way in which, it's a good critique, the way, as you were asking it, I think the best way to frame this actually would be, because it's congealed, this contestation in the Democratic and Republican Party, would to refer to Democrats and Republicans rather than left and right. And I think that would probably be better because, in fact, there's a long-running history in American political culture that anything that smacks of socialism is un-American. And the kind of camp that Biden's people would be in would probably take that line as well, and wouldn't want to be seen that he is kind of too progressive. So I take that criticism on board. It would be something that definitely, when we were doing this, we thought, oh, could this be done comparatively? It would have to be sensitive to that. Because of course, once you migrate to a different political culture, it becomes very different. So that's something we would have to be really aware of. So that's a really good point. I definitely take that criticism on board. And your other criticism, actually, I would take on board. I think you're referring to particularly like debates in democratic theory over whether democracy should be agonistic versus antagonistic. And it's interesting because I was wondering when I was writing the conclusion, do I speak to Habermas or not? And I felt like, in a sense, like Habermas had more weight. This is a kind of an American journal that I published in, and I kind of thought this, you know, to contrast the idealized, rational, democratic public sphere versus, you know, this like meaning-centered one that's not very rational at all. But I think, again, that's a good critique, but I think it would still stand. So if I would have framed it differently, I would suggest that this polarization over national identity suggests that American democracy is perhaps less agonistic and more antagonistic. So it's moving to something that's potentially going to move out of the democratic public sphere. So I I think the threat is still potentially there.
Mm.
But your general critique, you know, it's interesting that you asked that, because there was a debate in my head over which route to go there, so, yeah.
I
Thank
see you had your hand up, John, but before I come to you, I'd just like to inject myself in, because just relating to this point, so I'd like to push you in the opposite direction to where the last speaker was pushing you, and you seem to be happy to be pushed. So in your slide, your last slide, you said that nationalism appeals to emotions rather than reason. So I guess my objection is to the two words rather than. Certainly, nationalism appeals to emotions, as does political rhetoric in general. But politics has its own form of reasoning, which can't be reduced. And here I agree with this bit of Habermas. I don't agree with a lot of other Habermas, but I agree with this bit of Habermas, that political reasoning can't be reduced to instrumental reasoning, to means-end reasoning. It has an evaluative component, and going back to the very beginning of your talk, a meaning-creating and meaning-conferring and meaning-mobilizing dimensions. So it's not just purely rational, and I think actually Habermas is too rationalist on these matters. But the reasoning and the emotions have to come together, not be torn apart as some technocratic kind of paradigms of politics suggest. And we see that, you know, coming to the substances of what you're talking about, the content, we see that in the case of Obama. So in many ways, when I was looking at these tweets that you're presenting from Biden, I thought, well, this is really a poor version of Obama, isn't it? Because Obama presented a much more reasoned kind of civic patriotism, constitutional patriotism, that Biden could, that Biden was in some ways in the shadow of. I mean, he wasn't challenging you, but he wasn't able to argue at length. Now, you yourself said, well, of course, tweets are very short little things, and indeed they are. But I suppose the general point I'd want to make is that we do have an example in recent American presidential campaigns of a reasoned civic nationalism, which of course was rhetorically very powerful and emotional for people, you know, who received it as such. And it tends to defy the idea that nationalism is just about emotions and not about reason. And you know, more generally, you might like to think of Obama in relation to your kind of general discussion about what nationalism means in the US.
I think I should respond to that.
Well, maybe I'll let it settle and let John come in. Would you prefer that?
Sure, yes, okay.
Well, that was a bad choice. I have a question you can't answer, but you can reflect on it, because I'm just trying to think about the wider significance of nationalism, the relative significance of nationalism to electoral politics in America in 2020. And you know, the methods that you use won't get at that because you're missing the larger kind of context. You're not looking at other frames and the relative salience of a national frame compared to other frames or something. But you did say something about, I mean, you did, I don't remember the language you used. My language would be sort of like a meta frame. You sort of talked about nationalism being the kind of superordinate frame used in other issues as well. So you just kind of had this hierarchy of kind of, you know, being above something. So it did seem to suggest kind of some relative placement of nationalism, relative significance of nationalism. And that's what I kind of want to get at a little bit more, because so much of this, you know, I think you could read through this lens of just simple kind of political strategy, that what we know about Trump's strategy and what we know about Biden's. And so So, you know, Biden gives a civic thing, which certainly has national manifestations, but it's really about, you know, I can be the president for everyone. Whereas Biden is saying, you know, I'm the president for these people. So Biden has the more exclusionary approach. Sorry, Trump has the more exclusionary approach. Biden has the more inclusionary approach, and that maps onto the kind of ethnic civic divide that you're describing. But so it's easy to see the national dimensions of that, and that's what your data show, that's what you were looking for, and that's what you uncovered, and you can see how that matters. But could you just invert that and say this is about political strategy, or I'm not even sure what to call the frame, but something that's not just about the nation, but the nation is being used for another purpose rather than the nation rather than inverting that in the other way. So I guess it's just trying to think about the relative significance of the nation in the elections, vis-a-vis competing frames that aren't a part of your analysis, but you still might be able to reflect on.
I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, it would bear more research in return. Okay, what are the various competing frames? I think this paper is important regardless, because it highlights a frame that tends not to be highlighted. It tends to be kind of ignored, that this is a kind of core cleavage that people clash over. Thinking about Obama, but not directly in relation to your question, you know, something that we don't know from this paper because we focused on this one election, you know, what does this look historically? Is this the way that American presidential elections always play out? Is it increasing? Is it becoming more central? I'm not sure. You know, there's work out there to tentatively suggesting that since the election of Obama, which the kind of reaction amongst the Tea Party, which begat Trump, and then you begat a kind of reaction on the left, that we're seeing more of this, but that's something empirically to be found out. So I don't, you know, that's a key limitation of this paper. Whether or not nationalism is achieving one aim in relation to a different cleavage versus another, that, you know, I think that's important. It's something to return to, however, I think.
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, I thought the historical angle is, no, I was thinking about the historical angle as a way of kind of getting at that as well. It's another kind of contextual variable to sort of understand it. So I guess the question is not only about the context of it and the relevance of it compared to other things, but also the uses of it and the purposes of it as well. But yeah, so it's just reflection. Thanks.
No, thank you.
Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you. Really fascinating talk and really interesting arguments. And I don't really disagree with the main part, but as a few people are now saying, let's get to that last slide where there are a few issues there I think wanted to investigate. And I mean, just coming from my angle, I'm trying to write stuff on the current debate about the crisis of a liberal international order, and it's always framed in some of the ways it's come out already as this an external threat, which is Russia and China and so on, which is threatening international institutions of a liberal character. But then there's the internal threat, the rise of populism and nationalism and so on, even though you show that both sides actually buy into that same kind of discourse, but for different reasons and with different aims. But so given that we're living in this age of the crisis of the liberal international order, I kind of want to pose the question of, you know, can we avoid defending liberalism in some way? And that's why I wasn't as upset as some people about the use of Habermas, even though I'm not a friend of Habermas, because at least you can pose that in terms of democracy and the public sphere. And we can have a debate about rationality. I mean, he's a sucker for the Enlightenment, so I wouldn't buy his own words on it. But you could reinterpret him as just simply saying that there are grounds for preferring one set of arguments to another, and we can have a debate about that, and it can be dialogical. That doesn't necessarily buy you into Enlightenment theology. But what he doesn't do there, although people have said it's a bourgeois public sphere, and they've criticised it for that reason, but it doesn't necessarily buy you into defense of a liberal notion of public sphere. And that's where that's just the area where I get a bit worried, because On the one hand, I think you put up Mill at one point and did mention liberalism, having done a good bit of avoiding it at the top, yeah. And in the debates on the global dimension, John Eikenberry is well known now as saying we need to defend some notion of a liberal social contract. And that just plays into the hands of populist nationalists, because they say, well, who's involved in that social contract? It's a contract of elites, and then they can play the national card and make that an anti-liberal argument. So we don't want to get sucked into that kind of defense of liberalism, if that means defense of that kind of exclusionary social contract of Eikenberry's kind of take on it. So that's where I'm a bit worried. Can we kind of defend democracy without necessarily taking sides on this defending the liberal international order? Because if we do end up defending the liberal international order, we are defending an exclusionary white American Anglo-Saxon identity, I think, and all the origins of liberal international order are in colonialism and imperialism. So that's what worries me a bit, is how to defend something we clearly do want to take sides against Trump, but not necessarily in favor of something that isn't that much better, if you see where I'm going with that.
No, I mean, that kind of raises, it's a very interesting question. Because one of the things that I thought I would get questions about, I'm kind of worried about, is that, well, not worried, but I wondered what people would say, is that we're not just saying that Trump is the threat to American democracy. Also, Biden potentially is the threat to American democracy, because they're both framing the other side as a threat to America and to American peoplehood. And that's something that I feel that Americans, in particular liberal Americans, don't see it. It's like Trump and his supporters, these horrible people who are ruining America, and don't see that they're caught in this clash as well. And they have their own vision of America that doesn't include those people that support Trump. And so I thought, like, oh God, what are they going to think I'm a Trump supporter or something? Or rather what you thought is you're a defender of the kind of higher order liberal democratic framework that this sits within, which itself is liberal. And that's a great question, because that's exclusionary on its own. Because you do need to have some kind of agreed norms for this struggle to occur within. So I mean, that's a problematic that I don't know what the answer is to, but I mean, it's a valid critique in that sense. Just to show all my cards, this conversation is so interesting for me, at least. So thank you. Something that I did find, it didn't make sense in this paper, but it's something there, that kind of all the literature on, the cleavage of American political culture, is there were some crossover things that both Biden and Trump kind of agreed on that seemed to be like super sacred, that you don't cleave over. That the meaning is kind of like above. And the only reason it doesn't relate to your question, but I'm thinking of what form the parameters of American democracy, and there would be things like our troops, the flag, religion. They're kind of like untouchable. It's not something Biden couldn't besmirch. So many of his tweets said, "God bless our troops." And with that statement, God bless our troops, and it might have like the flag there. You can't touch those things.
Presumably the nation as well, even though they conceived it differently.
Yeah, exactly. And so,
But would even Bernie Sanders want to touch those things? Even the more radical left would also defend the troops for different reasons. Michael Moore's documentaries are very patriotic. So, I mean, coming from outside the US, we see the US as everybody is patriotic in a different way. It's just the left is saying it's unpatriotic to be right wing and capitalist and so on. But what we really want is the good American white collar, blue collar, support the troops.
yeah. So, talking to myself, I wonder, how correct is my thesis then? If the threat is this clash, when really maybe from a step back, there's some idea of America, of the nation that is very powerful, that they still tend to agree in the democratic sphere. You know, the military, God, our flag. Probably dig further in the English language as a means of communication.
Apple pie.
Apple pie. So, you know, I don't want to argue against myself, but you know, your question raises a lot of what is this kind of bigger container that I was discussing. Thank you.
I wonder if that's part of the point of nationalist ideology, is there are some things that are just beyond contestation. But, you know, the flag it being, you know, one of them. And we know how many people vote in the Senate to make flag burning a crime. Also, going back to John's point, is that, you know, Biden's looking for the kind of right-leaning blue-collar voters and to talk about the sort of the virtues of the American people that live in the countryside. These people got votes as well. So, but yeah, going back to also what you said, these are the kind of tropes that the teams know work. And my sense is also that Obama had quite a bit to say about American exceptionalism and the special character of America and all the rest of it. And, you know, I think you're right. People don't necessarily think about what they're saying, but they know what's acceptable and what strikes a chord and so on.
And that point, and perhaps also your point, Jonathan, I think it was, sorry, is I don't want to give the impression that I see, which does kind of is implied in a lot of the literature in American political culture, that the kind of civic side is kind of normatively always the good side. It does have this inclusive appeal, but there's still a boundary. It's still nationalism. You have to agree to certain things. You still have to be a liberal in the public sphere. And it's also, you know, where I said the myths of, you know, we're a kind of world historical nation that has cast off, you know, the old hierarchical ways of being, and we should therefore be a beacon of hope in the world, has a kind of aggressive side to it, you know, which of course feeds into neoconservatism, which it's not surprising that Biden in a way is a kind of great defender of neoconservatism, because it's kind of inbuilt into American liberalism that we should also go into the world and bash heads of people who don't agree, basically. So I maybe should be clear in the paper that the civic side is not necessarily the good side always.
But I thought one of the things that was interesting in your presentation was kind of, we might assume, you know, this implicit or perhaps explicit in what you said in your kind of opening remarks, we might assume that the right wing has a kind of strong upfront nationalism, and the center and the left, if they want, you know, to win elections, have to find a way of, to some extent, appealing to a slightly different kind of nationalism or to a diluted version of nationalism or whatever. But basically, they are chasing the strong nationalist rhetoric, or you know, countering it in some way, but chasing it in other ways. But your analysis showed that actually the strong, upfront, unashamed nationalism stroke patriotism came from Biden, and it was Trump that had to be a little bit more elusive, implicit, dog whistling, and so on, because at least insofar as the public sphere is concerned, the acceptable nationalism is that of the liberals. And while not everywhere in the world would take that, you know, that form, isn't it the case that in a lot of democracies, that part of the kind of liberal left is able to kind of make a nationalist historical case against right-wing nationalism, by appealing to something strong in the political tradition. So, I mean, here, when Boris Johnson, with his kind of Brexit nationalism and so on, wanted to prorogue Parliament and his, disrespect for the Supreme Court and the judiciary in general, there was a kind of a liberal left outrage, but, parliamentary sovereignty and the rule of law is absolutely central to our understanding of Britain and of British democracy. And of course, in France, even more strongly, the Republicans criticize Marine Le Pen and the National Rally as failing to live up to the Republican ideals of laicite and color blindness and ethnic blindness and so on. And in Germany, the AfD is said to violate the post-war constitutional order and so on. So there is a sense, not quite in the American way, and the American way may be perhaps our best example, fullest example of this point that you've kind of put your finger on. But there is a sense in which the liberal left appeals to the national political tradition in relation to protecting what it thinks it's absolutely sacred within that tradition and is about to be violated by populist nationalism.
It's a really good point. Also interesting because we've done comparative work on the case of the UK, and when I thought of this kind of sacred, the kind of untouchable aspects of the American national tradition, I was often thinking, what is it in the British case? This kind of uneven, not quite, it's a plurinational nation, and that for many people the flag is polluted, or they might fly not the Union flag, but they're kind of subnational flag, so it's not the flag. I don't know if it's the troops, but yeah, when Parliament, that was a violation, kind of a moral violation. So there are certain things that are kind of untouchable. Just have to dig over. Your comparative lens is really interesting.
Yeah, I want to say to people online, it's great to have you join us. If you have a question, please feel free to participate by making yourself visible or by raising the iconic hand. And Lauren.
I was just going to say, I wonder also whether you're talking about how Biden's kind of lent into this more nationalist rhetoric. Is it because of the normative kind of assumption that civic nationalism is better? So by being able to claim that more publicly, is that again, like this, as John was saying earlier, something to do with the kind of electoral strategy of it and how that's perceived more widely? Like, is it also that might be something to consider? Like what is seen as acceptable more broadly, and does that influence what is said, and whether one side, why it's not considered nationalism in the same way as it might publicly be understood?
Yeah, I think that's an important point, as we kind of continue to develop this concept, this conversation is kind of going around that, which I think is interesting. It's almost like in the American case, ideology that Biden was speaking to is the kind of UR text of the American nation. And this kind of antithesis, as I think Dominic Levin called it, is this kind of sub thing it's always been there from the beginning, but Biden can kind of speak to the Constitution and the founding fathers and the various speeches, and the kind of unspoken or the quiet thing, or that has been applied from the beginning of American history, that this is about white Anglo-Saxon males, which started to expand through American history. That's not written down anywhere in the founding documents necessarily. So it's always been a kind of antithesis in some way. So it does give me something to think about, in almost in the way in which I presented. It's a kind of balanced struggle, in the way it's typically presented, with both having widely institutionalized in practices and documents throughout American society. But one is certainly seen as the kind of hegemonic text, I suppose, that Biden could kind of lean into. Hence, he can be much more explicit about it. So just to repeat you, I think it's a good point.
We seem to have a pause that suggests we might be coming to an end, and we can end now, unless you want to revisit the issue about political reasoning and agonism. Or maybe over a drink.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, you're probably right that they're not always opposed.
I think we would be degrading our concept of politics if we thought that they were opposed, even within ideologies, because obviously nationalism isn't the only ideology. But maybe we can pick that up over a drink. So let's thank Eric for a really interesting paper in our usual way.
Please, thank you for attending and listening. Appreciate it.
And thank you to everyone who joined us online.